Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Martin Driver Show. Welcome back to another episode of our Russia and Ukraine coverage. The majority of the G7 summit is concluded, where over 80 countries met, except Russia was not invited. And most of these countries determined that the frozen Russian assets taken at the beginning of the war, 50 billion of them, will be used as a loan to give Ukraine more war materials, more supplies, essentially more overall aid. Now, of course, that's controversial. They froze the Russian assets at the beginning of the war, and now they're lending it out to the people that they're fighting the war against. But more things, I'm guessing, happened at this G7 summit. So we're going to go ahead and just get an overview of this statement and where a majority of the countries in the world stand as of right now. So without any further ado, let's get right on into the news.
G7 summit, as we've been telling you, but much of the work has already been wrapped up. Most of the leaders who flew in have already left, including the G7 leaders, like US President Joe Biden. He took off on an Air Force One last night, and while he isn't heading to nearby Switzerland, a bunch of the other leaders are for their next conference, as we've already mentioned. The major leaders were scheduled to leave Italy before today's session, so they wrapped up the important business yesterday, including the all-important G7 joint statement. Giorgia Meloni summarized the major points.
So what she was just summarizing there is that, there's another summit in Switzerland. A lot of the world leaders are heading there, but this summit is currently over. So,
with the final declaration, the G7 has taken on some specific commitments. We will continue to support Ukraine, and we have decided to systematize our efforts in various lines of action with a 360-degree approach to help the Ukrainian people look to the future. The G7 has reaffirmed this commitment, agreeing to additional financial support linked to the windfall profits derived from Russian assets frozen in our jurisdictions.
So that's in the official statement of the G7 leaders, that they're going to use the Russian frozen assets and they're going to take it and give it to Ukraine. I don't really know what this means. I mean, obviously, those assets were frozen. It doesn't mean that they're not Russian assets anymore. I don't think it's been determined that, Russia no longer owns the assets. They just don't have access to the assets. So does that mean Ukraine is going to have to pay Russia the money back? Or are we using the money expecting, the money back with interest in time? But when Russia gets their money back, we owe Russia the money. Essentially, who's responsible for getting Russia their $50 billion back if their assets are ever unfrozen, is my initial question.
The most important agreement was on funding for Ukraine. The G7 nations will give Ukraine $50 billion, but not from their own funds. Instead, they will be using Russian money, the interest that has been generated on frozen Russian assets. This is effectively getting Moscow to pay its enemies' bills. It's a unique...
That's interesting. So it's the interest generated on the frozen assets. So that means they're laying claim to any money that has been accumulated since the assets have been frozen. So I wonder how that plays out in a UN court if Russia were to sue for the total amount of their money back. Say it's 75 billion, the 50 billion. Well, no, it has to be. Let's say it's 100 billion. Say it was initially 50 billion and then they got 50 billion in interest, which I know is unrealistic. And now they're taking that 50 billion in interest and giving it to Ukraine as a loan. Does that mean that the G7 leaders have laid claim to that extra $50 billion? And how will that play out in court? Because in my head, just because you froze the assets and Russia doesn't have access to the assets, they still have ownership over the interest on the assets. So I think it still goes back to the point of who's going to pay them back $50 billion. But it seems is this a way of the G7 leaders saying, well, you don't technically own this money, and we're going to give it to your enemies, and we're never going to pay you back? Regardless, they're going to be, Russia's going to be pissed off because their money's being used to fight them. That's enough, I think, to drive anybody crazy. But that's a whole nother layer, is are they ever even going to see this extra $50 billion back?
Unique step, and it's likely to draw a reaction from Russia. That was the biggest takeaway from the G7 summit. Then there is the war in Gaza. All the G7 members have rallied behind the US.
We have confirmed our support for the United States mediation proposal for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the release of all hostages, and a significant increase in humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. The G7 also reiterated every effort to prevent an escalation in the region and to work towards a lasting political solution to the crisis with the perspective of a two-state solution for two peoples.
So I'm not fully informed yet on this ceasefire deal, but I do know a bit about, what went on between the protests, both sides of the war. I've heard plenty of Netanyahu statements. I've seen not just the social media, but plenty of news postings, a variety of things. And it seems like this ceasefire plan, if it were to actually be implemented, would be a very strong action, because it would, if I understand correctly, it would create two separate states. So the Palestinians have their state and Israel keeps their state. And it's just, there's a border, there's separate countries, separate governments. Then you're getting money into, the Gaza Strip, which has been pretty much obliterated, because of probably too far and too aggressive of tactics by Israel, alongside, the pictures of missiles being shot out of civilian camps. I think it's somewhere in the middle of the two sides there, alongside, the hostages being released. So I think that would give everybody what they'd want if it were to unfold. You're getting money in to rebuild the Gaza Strip. You're also giving the Palestinians a state so they can have their own government, their own control, and live their own life, while Israel can go back to working in their country, doing what they want to do, and the war can stop and people can stop dying, which I would hope is everybody's goal, because to me that should be the only goal, is that people shouldn't hate each other and people shouldn't be dying regardless of religion, race, what have you. But unfortunately that's not the case. That's not the world we live in. So I don't know that this ceasefire deal will take effect, because I've seen the headlines that, Netanyahu's not going to stop the war until his objectives are achieved, and B, Hamas isn't going to accept ceasefire deal without some, what I believe people have said are, not going to happen, restrictions that just aren't going to happen, or outcomes that they want that just aren't going to happen. So will the ceasefire deal take place? I hope so, but it doesn't look good. But if it does, I think that it actually might benefit everybody on a base level from what I can see. I don't know.
The G7 is backing the recent US ceasefire proposal. They will also increase humanitarian assistance.
So here you go. Phase 1, a complete ceasefire, which I think is the most important thing. Get people to stop dying. Then you're going to withdraw the Israeli forces, which is what, I think is maybe the most important step, because then you can stop the dying of civilians. Releasing some hostages and the remains of hostages. That kind of, I think the idea of that is that's their only leverage, so you let them give up some of it, but not all of it to start. And then you can restart civilian life and get a surge of humanitarian aid. That makes sense. So then phase 2, no more hostilities. I don't know what the difference between a ceasefire and hostilities is. Does the hostilities mean, like it says, just the remaining hostages? And then it says Israeli forces withdraw from Gaza. Okay, so they're saying the war is going to initially leave the populated areas of Gaza. Some hostages are going to be released, and they're going to start rebuilding those populated areas. Then phase 2 In the more rural areas, the forces are going to be withdrawn while the remaining hostages are going to be released. So then phase 3, they reconstruct Gaza, and the final remains are returned to their families. So from where we sit today, knowing we can't change the past, that seems like the best plan we could possibly have. Again, will it happen? I don't know.
Assistance to Gaza. On paper, this looks like a step towards peace. But can they really do anything to stop Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Until there's a concrete way forward, these just seem like empty words. The third big takeaway involves migration, and this was a personal issue for Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She's been looking for a way to stop illegal migration to Europe, mostly from Africa. Italy is caught in the middle of this because it is often the gateway for migrants who arrive on Italian shores via the Mediterranean Sea on dilapidated boats. Meloni's plan is simple: stop the problem at its root. A lot of the migrants leave.
I know this is a completely different issue, but I mean, we're listening to world news right now, and if you're feeling like sticking around, I appreciate it. It seems like the migration issues aren't just in America, and this is good for me to see, just to learn that, how it works in other worlds and what they have to say. And I hope, if you're also an American and you're watching and you've never heard about this, or if you're anyone who hasn't heard about this, you stick around, because the more we know about what's going on around the world, why it's going on, maybe the more we can help each other, and we can figure out the causes of things, and we can figure out how to make a better overall world, not just for some countries, not just for some people, but for everybody. But I want to see what they have to say about this African migration issue through Italy into, I believe, the UK. Maybe I was wrong.
Leave their countries in
Europe.
search of economic opportunities.
In general.
But why not just bring the opportunities to their home nations? That's the crux of Meloni's strategy. It's called the Mattei Plan. And she has managed to rope in the rest of the G7 for it. She wants to coordinate all their existing efforts to invest in developing nations, like the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment and the EU's Global Gateway Initiative. Meloni wants all these plans to work in tandem to better direct the flow of investments, especially to Africa.
I would like to research more into Meloni and see what that plan entails. This isn't what I kept you guys here for, but the idea, bring the opportunity where it needs to go. If you build up the entire world, it should be better for everybody. We just got to stop hating people and stop going to war with people and stop diminishing people because of their way of life or the differences you might have with them. Maybe talk it out. Maybe you figure you like some things that they do. Maybe if they figure that they like some things you do. Maybe you just agree to disagree. But if we can all work together, maybe we can create a peaceful world. And that's the hope and that's the dream. I appreciate you guys listening to the news with me, just hearing what I got to say, having a good time together. I think this G7 statement is pretty simple in the sense that it's not surprising of what they're doing, but I don't know how this $50 billion plays out. I mean, if you're Russia and, you earn $50 billion in inaccessible interest, you'd still be just as mad if that $50 billion just disappeared, especially to your enemies, because you know where it goes. There's a paper trail to the people who are now allowed to use better weapons in your country. You got to connect the puzzle pieces. These aren't just independent stories. And so it's clearly escalating more. These assets have been frozen for years. Maybe this was in the plan all along because it is the interest, but I see this as an escalation. I wouldn't call it a major escalation, but I would say it's just another kind of thorn in Russia's side. And will that thorn contribute to killing Russia, or will it just keep pissing it off? We would just have to, unfortunately, as civilians, wait and see.